He came for isolation, found a savage alien cat Gladiator under his cabin. Carter had always believed that peace was a luxury only those who had seen the worst of life could truly appreciate. After years of endless wars, battles that left both his body and soul scarred, he longed for nothing more than a quiet place far away from the chaos of the galaxy. He had seen too much: the screams, the blood, the people he had lost. When the war ended, and the galaxy slowly returned to a semblance of normality, Jack knew that he couldn't go back to his old life. He had left it all behind: the military, the missions, the duty, all of it. The planet he chose was far from any established colony, a barren world at the edge of the known universe. It was a place few dared to settle, let alone explore. A desolate world where the wind howled, and the land seemed to stretch endlessly with little more than rocky hills and distant mountains. Jack rented a small, modest cabin tucked away in the farthest corner of the planet, isolated from any civilization. No neighbors. No distractions, just the empty wilderness and his thoughts. He had hoped that the silence would be enough to soothe the darkness that clung to his heart. The first few days were blissful. He spent his time hunting, gathering, and just walking through the alien landscapes, his mind free from the weight of his past. The air was fresh, and the nights were still, with only the distant stars for company. It was exactly what he needed. However, as the days passed, something strange began to stir in the air. At first, it was subtle: small noises in the night that could have been the wind, a rustling under the cabin floor, or the creaking of the wooden structure as it settled. Jack told himself it was nothing to worry about. This was a wild planet after all, and creatures lived beneath the surface. He had seen evidence of burrowing animals during his hunting trips. Yet there was something unsettling about the noises. They came at night when the world was supposed to be asleep. They seemed too deliberate, too rhythmic to be the work of mere wildlife. It wasn't long before Jack's peace started to crumble. On the third night, the sounds were louder. A scratching like claws dragging across metal. The noise came from beneath the floorboards of the cabin. Jack sat up, his eyes wide in the darkness, listening intently. His hand reached instinctively for the rifle beside his bed. It had been years since he had felt the need to carry a weapon, but old habits never died. The sound persisted, a scraping and thumping that seemed to be getting closer. It was unlike anything he had ever heard before. He felt a tightening in his chest, a creeping unease that threatened to rise into full-blown fear. Jack wasn't a man easily frightened, but this was different. There was something alien about the noise, something that tugged at his instincts and made his muscles tense. His military training kicked in, and he moved cautiously to the cabin's entrance, rifle in hand. He peered out into the moonlit night, scanning the barren horizon. There was no sign of life, no movement. The planet was still, too still. With a steady breath, Jack approached the cabin's small storage area, where the strange noise seemed to be emanating from. He knelt and examined the floorboards, running his fingers along the edges. Beneath them, there was a hidden hatch, cleverly disguised and covered in dust. The strange sound had come from there. Whatever was under his cabin, it wasn't just a wild animal. Jack hesitated for a moment. His mind raced through possibilities: some kind of underground creature, or perhaps a piece of old technology. His fingers brushed the edges of the hatch, and with a firm tug, it opened with a low groan. The hatch led to a small, dark space beneath the cabin, barely big enough for a person to crawl through. There was no telling what might be waiting down there. But Jack knew one thing: he couldn't ignore it. He grabbed a flashlight from the shelf and descended carefully into the dark. The air was damp and cold. As his boots hit the ground, the sound stopped. The quiet was absolute, almost suffocating. He stood still, listening to the echo of his own breath. Then something moved, a sudden shift in the shadows. Jack's heart skipped a beat. From the darkness, two glowing eyes stared back at him. They gleamed like molten gold, wild and feral. A low growl rumbled in the air. Jack's grip tightened around his flashlight, the beam sweeping across the space. He froze. A shape moved toward him, a form unlike anything he had ever seen. It was large, almost feline in appearance, with sleek fur that shimmered under the dim light. But this creature was not like any cat Jack had ever encountered. Its muscles rippled beneath its fur, and its claws were sharp as obsidian. The creature stepped into the light, revealing more of itself. It was a predator, tall and imposing, with a long, powerful tail and a pair of wings folded neatly along its back. But it was its eyes that drew Jack's attention. The eyes of a warrior, wild and proud, yet filled with an unmistakable pain. The creature's gaze held his for a long moment, as if sizing him up, calculating whether he was a threat. Jack didn't move. He knew better than to make any sudden motions. The creature's lips curled back in a low snarl, showing sharp teeth that looked capable of tearing through bone. It took another step forward, its growl deepening into something more menacing. Jack instinctively raised the rifle, though he had no intention of firing. The creature had the look of something far too dangerous, but there was something in its posture that told him it wasn't just some mindless beast. It was intelligent, perhaps more so than many of the humans Jack had known. The standoff stretched on. Jack didn't dare speak. The creature seemed to be weighing him, testing his resolve. Jack had been in enough life-and-death situations to know that patience was key. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the creature lowered its head, acknowledging him in some way that Jack couldn't quite understand. The snarl softened, and its glowing eyes softened as well. Without warning, the creature collapsed to the floor, exhausted and injured. It let out a soft hiss of pain, the tension in its body fading. Jack lowered the rifle, his mind racing. What was this thing? An alien, yes, but what kind of alien? Why was it here under his cabin, and what had happened to it? Jack took a careful step forward, lowering his flashlight to get a better look at the creature. It was clearly wounded, though the severity of its injuries wasn't immediately apparent. The fur around its side was matted with blood. It needed help. Despite the fear that still gripped him, Jack's instincts kicked in. He couldn't just leave it here to die. His heart thudded in his chest, but Jack knelt down beside the creature, his voice soft and steady. "You're not alone," he murmured, unsure if the alien understood. "I'll help you." It was then that Jack realized something. This was no ordinary alien creature. This was a gladiator. An experienced fighter, and perhaps something far more than he could have ever expected to find under his cabin. Jack Carter stood over the alien, his mind swirling with questions. The creature's breathing was shallow, labored, but it was still alive. Its eyes, once fierce and full of aggression, had softened, and there was a hint of helplessness in them now. Jack knew that it wasn't the time for hesitation. He had spent enough time in dangerous situations to recognize when survival depended on quick thinking. Carefully, he placed the rifle down beside him, making sure not to make any sudden movements. The creature, though it had lowered its guard, still exuded a sense of raw power. Its sleek fur rippled as it shuddered, clearly in pain. Jack's military training kicked in again, and he instinctively began to assess the situation. The creature's wounds weren't severe at first glance, but the blood seeping from its side was a worrying sign. It looked like it had been through hell, the fur around its wound matted and stained. It had the kind of injuries that came from being in a fight, a brutal life-or-death struggle. Jack's thoughts began to race. Who or what could have done this to it? Gritting his teeth, Jack pulled himself together. He had the tools in his cabin to tend to a wound, but the creature's physiology was completely alien. Would his medical supplies even work on it? He had no idea. But what other choice did he have? He stepped away from the creature briefly, his mind working quickly. The cabin wasn't far, and he knew where his first aid kit was. The idea of leaving the alien alone, even for a few minutes, made him nervous, but he had no other option. He had to act fast. If it was going to survive, he needed to at least try. Jack made his way back to the cabin and grabbed the kit, praying it would be enough. When he returned, the creature hadn't moved, though its eyes followed his every step. Its expression was unreadable, but Jack could tell it was watching him closely. His stomach tightened as he knelt down next to it again, unsure of what to do. "Hey," Jack said softly, more to reassure himself than anything else. "I'm going to help you, okay?" The creature didn't react, but Jack could see that it was still alert, despite the pain. He carefully opened the first aid kit, trying to make sense of the various medical supplies he had. None of them were designed for an alien species. None of them could even begin to understand the biology of this creature. But he had to make do. He pulled out a clean cloth and gently dabbed it against the wound. The creature hissed softly in pain, but it didn't move away. Jack's hands were steady, though his mind was racing. He tried to clean the wound as best as he could, but it wasn't easy. The alien's skin and fur were unlike anything he had ever seen. There were strange patterns along its body that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the cabin. It was beautiful in its own way, wild, primal, and yet graceful, like a creature born for battle. Once he had cleaned the area as best as he could, Jack hesitated. He wasn't sure what to do next. but he knew he had to keep the creature alive long enough to figure out what had happened to it. He reached into his medical supplies for a bandage, his hands slightly trembling as he wrapped it around the alien's side. The creature didn't flinch, but Jack noticed it was still watching him closely. The bond between them, however strange, was forming quickly. It was a strange thing, Jack thought. He had come to this planet to escape, to be left alone. And now, here he was, tending to an alien gladiator who had somehow ended up under his cabin. A fierce, wild warrior who had likely fought in brutal arenas, a creature who had probably been through horrors that Jack could only begin to imagine. And now it was here in his cabin, wounded and vulnerable. Once the bandage was in place, Jack took a step back. He wiped his brow, unsure of what to do next. The creature didn't move. Its eyes, though still glowing, seemed to soften, almost in gratitude. Jack felt a strange sense of relief, as if the alien was thanking him in its own way. Despite everything, Jack couldn't help but feel a strange connection to it. A creature that had known violence and survival in a way Jack could only relate to. A creature that had survived against all odds just like he had. Jack sat back, exhausted from the effort. He wasn't sure how long he'd been working, but he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The quiet of the cabin was now filled with an unspoken tension, the air heavy with the presence of the alien and the uncertainty that hung between them. Jack didn't know what to expect. He didn't know if the creature would recover or if it would turn on him the moment it had the strength. He didn't know if it could even understand him. But what he did know was that he couldn't leave it to die, not when he had the chance to help. It was then that the creature spoke, its voice low and rough like gravel scraping against stone. The words were unfamiliar to Jack, a series of harsh, guttural sounds that he couldn't even begin to understand. He stared at the alien, his heart skipping a beat. It had spoken. To him, and somehow, Jack had the unsettling feeling that it wasn't just a random noise. There was intent in the way the creature spoke. It wasn't just a sound. It was a message. Jack blinked, trying to make sense of it. "I don't understand," he said, his voice tentative. "I can't." The creature's eyes narrowed, and its lips parted in what Jack could only guess was a gesture of frustration. It didn't speak again, but its gaze never left him, its eyes intense and searching. It was clear that the alien was waiting for something. Jack swallowed, feeling a strange weight settle in his chest. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The creature didn't respond, but Jack could feel its gaze boring into him, as if it was trying to read him, understand him in a way that made his skin crawl. It was both intimidating and strangely captivating, like looking into the eyes of something ancient and powerful. Then, without warning, the creature made a movement that caused Jack to jump. It was swift, too fast for Jack to react. But instead of attacking, it simply lowered its head, as if conceding to him. Its tail twitched nervously behind it, and Jack could see that the tension in its body had eased, if only slightly. The growl had stopped, replaced by a soft purr, almost as if the creature were content. Jack let out a long breath. It was a start. He didn't know what the creature wanted, but he knew one thing for sure. His life was no longer his own. Whatever this creature was, whatever its story was, Jack was now part of it. And somehow, he felt like he had just stepped into a much larger world than he had ever imagined. Jack awoke to the sound of gentle purring. He had never expected that such a sound, so soft and comforting, could come from the same creature that had once looked at him with the fierce intensity of a predator. The alien had calmed down considerably since the night before, its deep wounds bandaged, and its once violent energy replaced by a wary quietness. The creature, Kara, as Jack had decided to call her, though she had yet to communicate in any meaningful way, was still beneath the cabin, resting on the makeshift bedding Jack had placed there. It had been 2 days since the encounter. 2 days since Jack had found himself knee-deep in something he could never have anticipated. The creature, a battle-hardened gladiator, had gone from snarling hostility to cautious trust in that short span of time. Kara had not moved much, save for occasional shifts to adjust her position, and Jack had done his best to keep her fed and hydrated with what little he had. The bandages around her side had remained surprisingly clean, though there was still an unmistakable tension in the air, one that neither of them had acknowledged fully. Jack had always been a man of action, a soldier who followed orders without hesitation, but this was different. There were no commands, no missions, no tactical plans. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do next. Kara's injuries had healed in part, but she was far from ready to move. And Jack wasn't sure if he was prepared to help her flee or if she would even accept such a suggestion. He'd seen enough of the galaxy's cruel systems to know that no one, no matter how strong, escaped the shackles of their past easily. Kara's past was written in the scars on her body and the defiant fire in her eyes. Sitting by the entrance to the underground chamber, Jack let his rifle rest across his lap. He kept the weapon close, as much out of habit as necessity. Despite the trust Kara had shown, he couldn't ignore the raw power she still radiated. She wasn't just an injured alien. She was a warrior, a gladiator who had fought her way to survival in some of the most brutal arenas in the galaxy. There were moments when Jack couldn't help but wonder what kind of life she had lived before finding her way to his cabin. What had driven her to flee so far from the arenas? What had happened to her that had left her in such a desperate state? Jack's thoughts were interrupted by a low groan. Kara shifted on the bedding, her glowing eyes opening, and she looked directly at him. Her gaze was still guarded, but there was a flicker of something else now. Curiosity, maybe. Her sharp features softened just a bit, and for a moment it seemed like the warrior inside her was allowing herself a brief respite. "Are you hungry?" Jack asked gently, though he wasn't sure if she understood him. She hadn't shown any signs of recognition when he spoke to her in the past, but Jack didn't think it would hurt to try. Kara blinked, her eyes narrowing slightly as if considering his question. Her tail flicked in response, a motion that seemed more uncertain than the confident swishing of earlier days. She slowly shifted her weight and then stood, the muscles in her body rippling with each movement. She wasn't fully recovered, but she was strong, perhaps stronger than Jack had anticipated. Jack stood as well, watching her carefully. He wanted to help to make her feel at ease, but the barriers between them were more than just physical. They were cultural, emotional, and perhaps something deeper. Kara was an alien warrior. Jack was just a man. There was a vast chasm of difference between them, one that had nothing to do with their biology and everything to do with their lives and experiences. But in this strange situation, Jack couldn't help but feel an odd bond forming between them. Kara moved closer, her movements slow but deliberate. Jack took a step back to give her space, unsure of how she might react. For all he knew, she could still be wary of him, just waiting for the right moment to strike. Yet when she stopped in front of him, she didn't make a move to attack. Instead, she sat down, her eyes flicking toward the small pile of food Jack had set out earlier. He had hoped to entice her to eat something, though he wasn't sure if she would be able to digest the same things he did. Without a word, Jack took a deep breath and handed her a small bowl of dried meat and fruit. The food was simple, something he could easily prepare, and he hoped it was something she could at least try. Kara eyed the bowl for a moment, and Jack could feel the weight of the silence between them. She was sizing him up again, deciding whether or not she could trust him. And Jack had no way of knowing whether she would accept the offering or attack him in response. The silence stretched on. Then, to Jack's surprise, Kara carefully took the bowl from his hands with her claws, her movements precise, almost delicate. She sniffed at the contents before taking a tentative bite. Jack held his breath as she chewed, waiting for some sign of approval or disapproval. After what felt like an eternity, she nodded slightly, acknowledging the food. It was a small gesture, but it was progress. Jack sat down across from her, finally allowing himself to relax, though he kept his eyes on her. He wasn't sure where this strange partnership was headed, but he knew one thing. He couldn't ignore the possibility that they were both in this together now. Kara might not be ready to talk or trust him fully, but she was slowly showing signs of acceptance. The bond between them had shifted, even if just a little, and that, Jack thought, was a step in the right direction. For the next few hours, they shared the quiet space. Kara ate slowly, savoring each bite as though it had been a long time since she had tasted anything like it. Jack watched her, wondering what she was thinking. Was she grateful for his help? Or was she simply waiting for the right time to leave and return to whatever dangerous life she had known before? As the day wore on, Jack found himself growing more comfortable with the silence between them. They didn't need to talk to understand each other. There was an unspoken understanding forming, one based not on words but on actions. Jack had saved her life. In return, she had shown him a side of herself that went beyond the fierce gladiator he had first encountered. She was a survivor, a warrior who had been shaped by a lifetime of violence, but she was also something else, a being capable of vulnerability, capable of trust. Jack's mind wandered to the idea of leaving the planet, of escaping the quiet isolation he had sought when he first came here. He had hoped that this world would give him the peace he craved, but now he realized that peace might be a luxury he could never afford. Kara had changed everything. She wasn't just an alien in need of help. She was a reminder of the world he had tried to leave behind, the violence and the conflict that seemed to follow him wherever he went. But maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe it was time for him to face the past, to confront the things he had tried to escape. Kara finished her meal, and Jack noticed that her posture had changed. She no longer looked as if she were constantly on edge, ready to pounce at the slightest movement. She seemed to be more at ease, though not completely. Her eyes met Jack's once more, and for the first time since their encounter, she spoke. Her voice was rough, like gravel scraping against stone, but there was an unmistakable clarity to it. "I'm not your enemy," she said, her words simple but carrying a weight of meaning. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Jack to understand. She was offering him the same thing he had given her: trust, a fragile, uncertain trust, but trust nonetheless. Jack nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "I didn't think you were." They sat there in silence for a while longer, both of them unsure of what came next. Jack had no answers, no plans, but he knew one thing. Whatever happened, he was no longer alone in this isolation. Days passed, and Jack's life began to shift in ways he hadn't expected. The cabin, which had once felt like a safe haven, now felt like the heart of a strange partnership. Kara, the alien gladiator, had made a slow but steady recovery. The wounds she'd sustained during her escape were healing, though Jack still wasn't sure how much longer she could stay hidden from whatever enemies she had left behind. The very thought of her past, the horrors of the arena and the enemies hunting her, weighed heavily on him. He knew that he couldn't keep her here forever. Despite the uncertainty, life had settled into a strange rhythm. Every morning, Jack would check on Kara, ensuring she was eating and resting enough. Kara had begun to venture out of the underground lair, though she still moved cautiously, testing her strength after weeks of lying injured. Her movements were slow at first, but over time, the grace and power that had once marked her as a deadly warrior began to return. Jack watched with a mix of awe and worry. He had no idea where she planned to go or what would happen if her pursuers found her. But for the moment, the two of them shared the same space in quiet solidarity. Jack had learned that Kara didn't speak much. Her words were sparse, her voice rough, but when she did speak, it was clear that there was more to her than just the warrior instincts she had honed. She wasn't just a survivor. She was someone who had been broken, reshaped by a lifetime of violence, but now she seemed to be looking for something else. A chance to start anew, even if she couldn't fully grasp how to do that. One evening, as the sky outside darkened, Kara stood in front of the cabin, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. The setting sun cast long shadows over the land, and for a moment, the silence between them seemed to stretch out further than the horizon. Jack stood behind her, watching her, wondering what she was thinking. He had seen the same quiet resolve in her eyes on the first day they met, but now it was mixed with something else. Something softer, more vulnerable. She wasn't just a fighter anymore. She was a person struggling to heal from a past that wasn't her own choice. "What's out there?" Jack asked, breaking the silence. Kara's tail flicked slightly in response, but she didn't turn to look at him. She was lost in thought, the question clearly weighing on her. After a moment she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "The world outside is a cage," she said. "A cage made of rules and battles. I've spent my life fighting in one arena after another. I was made to fight. I didn't choose it." Jack took a step closer, his gaze following hers out into the fading light. The mountains looked so far away, their jagged peaks cutting into the sky. "I've been there," Jack replied, his voice steady. "I didn't choose the battles either, but I chose to walk away." Kara's eyes shifted toward him, studying him for a long moment, as if trying to understand what he meant. It wasn't the first time she had looked at him like that, like he was something foreign, something she hadn't quite figured out yet. But there was a glimmer of recognition in her gaze, as if she was beginning to see him not just as the man who had patched up her wounds, but as something more. "You left the war?" Kara asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "How?" Jack let out a long breath, his mind drifting back to the days when he had made that decision. The decision that had changed everything. He hadn't walked away from war easily. It had taken years of fighting, of watching people die, of losing pieces of himself that he could never get back. But eventually, he'd come to a point where he couldn't fight anymore. He couldn't watch as people he cared about were sent off to die for causes they didn't believe in. "I walked away because I had nothing left," Jack said simply. "I had lost everything, my friends, my purpose, even my sense of who I was. But I found something I needed more than the war. I found peace." Kara didn't speak for a long time, but Jack could feel her considering his words. There was a shift in the air, something delicate and fragile passing between them. They were two people from entirely different worlds, but for some reason, Jack felt a connection, something that transcended their differences. She was a warrior, trained to kill without hesitation. He was a soldier who had once believed in the cause but had since become disillusioned. They were both broken in their own ways, but they were both seeking something else now, something more than just survival. The silence stretched on, and Jack took a step forward, his boots crunching in the dirt. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for, perhaps just a chance to help her, to give her a chance at something more. But as he stood next to her, watching the last traces of sunlight disappear behind the mountains, Jack realized that he didn't want to be alone anymore. He hadn't planned for Kara to become part of his life, but she had, and in a strange way, he was beginning to think that perhaps they needed each other. "I don't know where you're planning to go," Jack said finally, breaking the silence once again. "But I can't just leave you here alone, not after everything you've been through." Kara turned her head slightly, her eyes flicking toward him. "And what would you do?" she asked, her voice sharp, though there was no malice in it. "You can't protect me forever." Jack didn't flinch at the challenge in her voice. Instead, he met her gaze head-on, his jaw set in determination. "I'm not trying to protect you forever, but I'm not going to just leave you to fight alone either. Whatever's out there, whatever's chasing you, we can face it together." Kara's expression softened for the briefest of moments, and for the first time, Jack saw a flicker of something like hope in her eyes. It was fleeting, but it was there. "You don't have to fight alone either, Jack," Kara said quietly. "I didn't choose this life, but I will fight if I have to." Jack nodded. "Then we fight together, we'll figure it out, one step at a time." The next few days were filled with the heavy weight of preparation. They didn't talk much about their plans, but both of them knew what was coming. Jack knew that Kara's enemies would eventually find her, and when they did, they would stop at nothing to capture or kill her. There was no escaping the past, no matter how much they wanted to leave it behind. But Jack also knew that he couldn't just stay hidden forever. Eventually, they would have to confront whatever it was that had driven Kara to this point. And so they began to prepare for what lay ahead. Jack sharpened his old survival skills, setting traps around the cabin and gathering supplies for a long journey. Kara, despite her injuries, began to train again, her movements slowly becoming sharper, more fluid. It was clear that she was more than just a survivor. She was a warrior, and in a way, her instincts were starting to return to her. She had fought in some of the galaxy's deadliest arenas, and though she hadn't fought in years, the fire inside her was far from extinguished. Together, they built a plan, no matter how risky it might be. They would leave the cabin behind, head into the wilderness, and find a way to evade the hunters. It wasn't going to be easy, and they both knew the dangers that awaited them. But for the first time in a long time, Jack felt like he wasn't alone. Whatever came next, they would face it together. As night fell, Jack and Kara stood side by side, gazing out into the darkness. The stars above seemed endless, a vast expanse that stretched far beyond anything they could see. They didn't speak, but for a moment there was peace between them. The quiet of the wilderness was theirs, and for just a little while they could pretend that nothing else mattered. The night was quiet, but Jack couldn't shake the sense of urgency that had settled in his chest. Kara was ready. She had spent days recovering, training her body to move as it once had, her instincts slowly coming back to her like an old rhythm. Jack had done everything he could to prepare for what was coming next, but there was no escaping the truth. Their time in the cabin was running out. The hunters were close. He could feel it in the air, in the way the wind shifted and the quiet of the world around them felt unnatural. Kara was standing at the edge of the cabin, looking out into the distance, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Jack stood behind her, his heart beating faster with each passing minute. He had never been good at waiting, never been the kind of man to sit still while danger loomed. But now, all he could do was wait and hope that they were ready. "Are you sure about this?" Jack asked, his voice low and steady. Kara turned to look at him, her sharp features softened by the dim light, Her eyes, though still intense, were calm. The fierce gladiator inside her had always been there, but now it was tempered with something else, something more human. "I'm ready," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have no choice." Jack nodded, understanding more than she realized. He knew what it was like to feel trapped, to be driven by a need to survive. The galaxy was full of things that sought to destroy you, and sometimes you had no choice but to fight back. But Jack had also learned that there was more to life than just surviving. He wanted more for Kara than to be caught in a never-ending battle for her life. But he knew that whatever came next, it was something they would have to face together. The stars overhead were dimmer than usual, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Jack gathered his things, making sure everything was ready for the journey ahead. They had no destination, no plan beyond escape. It didn't matter. All that mattered was getting out of the cabin and into the wilderness before the hunters found them. "Let's go," Kara said, her voice steady, and with that the two of them set off into the night. The land around them was as harsh and unforgiving as it had always been, but there was a strange sense of clarity in the stillness. The sky was overcast, the moon hidden behind clouds, and the only sounds were the crunch of their footsteps on the rocky ground and the occasional rustle of wind through the sparse trees. The air was thick with tension, but neither Jack nor Kara spoke. There was no need to. They both knew what was at stake. They traveled in silence for hours, moving deeper into the wild, away from the cabin, away from the hunters. The path they followed was rugged and treacherous, but it was the best route they had. Jack had lived off the land long enough to know how to survive in the wilderness, and he was teaching Kara everything he could. She was quick to learn, her instincts sharper than any guidebook he had read. Together, they made their way through the forest, careful to cover their tracks and avoid any signs that they had passed through. As the hours stretched on, the tension between them began to shift. It wasn't that Jack didn't trust Kara, it was more that he didn't want to trust too easily. He had learned the hard way that survival often meant keeping people at arm's length. But with Kara, something was different. She wasn't just an ally, she wasn't just a survivor. She was someone who had fought against everything the universe had thrown at her, and now she was fighting to live, just as Jack was. Kara's eyes flicked toward him as they paused near a stream, her gaze lingering on his face for a moment before looking away again. "You don't trust me?" she said, her voice flat, but there was no anger in it, only a strange sort of resignation. Jack didn't answer right away. He crouched down by the stream, filling his water bottle, his mind working through her words. It was true. He didn't trust her completely, not yet. There was too much he didn't know about her, about what she had been through. But there was something in the way she had looked at him the night they shared a meal, something in the way she had chosen to trust him. He couldn't ignore that. "I trust you more than you think," Jack said finally, standing and meeting her eyes. "But trust isn't the same as knowing someone. We're still getting to know each other, Kara, and that's all right. But I'm here, I'm not leaving you." Kara didn't speak, but the faintest hint of a smile tugged at the corner of her lips. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Jack could see the weight lifting from her shoulders just slightly. She was letting down her guard, just enough for him to see the person she was underneath the warrior exterior. For the first time since they met, Jack felt like he was getting through to her. The silence returned as they continued their journey, but it wasn't uncomfortable anymore. Jack found himself wondering how much of their journey had been about survival and how much had been about learning to trust. They weren't just running from the past anymore, they were running towards something. What exactly, Jack wasn't sure. But he knew one thing for certain, he wasn't alone. Hours passed and the sky began to lighten. The first hints of dawn broke through the clouds, casting a faint, gray light over the wilderness. They hadn't stopped to rest, not since they'd left the cabin. Neither of them wanted to slow down, not until they were sure they had evaded the hunters. But Jack could feel the exhaustion settling in his bones, his muscles aching from the long hours of travel. Kara, too, seemed to be tiring, though she never showed it. She was a creature of endurance, of strength, and even though her body was still healing, she kept pace with him without complaint. Finally, they reached a small cave, nestled against the side of a steep cliff. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to shelter them for the moment. They could rest, gather their strength, and figure out what to do next. As they entered the cave, Kara immediately dropped to the ground, her body heavy with fatigue. Jack sat down beside her, watching as she leaned against the cave wall. There was no easy way to say what needed to be said, but he felt it hanging in the air between them. "Are you all right?" Jack asked quietly, his voice more concerned than he had meant it to be. Kara looked at him, her expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that might have been gratitude. Or perhaps it was something deeper, something she had never allowed herself to feel before. "I'll be fine," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I've been through worse, we both have." Jack nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of those words. She was right. They had both survived things most people could never imagine, but this time they were doing it together. They weren't alone anymore, and that thought gave Jack a sense of peace, however fleeting it might be. The cave was silent for a long time as they sat there, the sound of their breathing the only noise in the stillness. The danger wasn't gone, not by a long shot, but for the first time Jack felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe they would make it out of this. Maybe they could outrun the past and find a new future. Kara turned her head slightly, her voice quiet but filled with purpose. "You're not leaving, are you?" Jack shook his head, meeting her gaze with a quiet certainty. "No, I'm not leaving you." And in that moment, Jack realized that it didn't matter what came next. Whatever dangers they faced, whatever enemies hunted them, they would face it together. It wasn't about survival anymore. It was about something more. They were no longer just two people running from their pasts. They were two people building something new, a partnership, a future, and maybe even a chance at peace. And with that thought, Jack let himself relax just for a moment. Whatever came next, he was ready.